Up and at 'em. Perhaps you're in a situation where you're fighting with someone, and there are other people in your life who are trying to stay neutral, and you're trying to explain to them how you're feeling. Or perhaps you're witnessing people you care about fighting with one another, and you really want to stay neutral. Don't worry, I'm here to help. I'm Regina Lux, this is Veritas on the Rocks, and welcome to my pretty little soapbox. We're going to talk about good versus evil. Well, not that extreme, but you get the gist. I'm going to address how there are usually two distinct sides in any interpersonal relationship conflict, and how it's nearly impossible to stay neutral while also being informed. Neutral meaning they don't get involved in the conflict and also stay in good standing with both parties. I'm going to speak about these distinct sides and how you can identify which side is which, the difference between staying neutral and getting involved, and then I'll hit you up with some examples at the end to kind of drive these points home. Of course, all of this is going to be spoken of in a smaller context, such as conflicts between family and friends, and not so much in the larger context, such as between countries. This is all about interpersonal relationship conflicts. Let's start with this. There's almost always an instigator side and an innocent side. That's how it is. I'm sick and tired of this garbage of, there's two sides to every story, because the fact is that in most conflicts, there's usually an abuser and an abused. And trying to say that both sides are equally to blame for the conflict is absolute nonsense. Now, am I saying one side is 100% to blame? No. But there's usually one side that instigates and the other side that defends themselves from these actions. And equating the victim's actions of defense with the instigator's intention, it's downright disingenuous. This includes the middle ground people who get upset with victims for putting up healthy boundaries against their abusers. Don't victim blame. That's like a man trying to rape a woman and you getting mad at her for punching him in the face. No. People deserve the right to stand up for themselves. And if one person harms someone else, do not chide the victim for setting up healthy boundaries to defend themselves. The instigator carries the majority of the blame unless in cases where both parties are abusers. Now, does that mean that one side is a saint and the other one is the devil? No. Don't take it to mean that extreme, since honestly no one's blameless in their heart. But not having a blameless heart also does not equate to not having blameless actions. It is possible for someone to choose to behave virtuously even in the face of an instigator they don't like. Not caring for that other person doesn't automatically make them at fault. People have a right to their opinions. What matters are actions. Does this mean the non-instigator gets away with over-the-top reactions? Also, no. People are responsible for their own emotional reactions to others. People ought to act justly even when defending themselves, i.e., not seeking vengeance or just downright vicious retaliation. Emotional stability goes a long way in order to be able to distinguish which party is which. Also, the instigator will oftentimes attack someone who is emotionally unstable at the time in order to paint them out as the instigator. But as an observing party, it ought to be noted when someone is acting defensively, and the blame shouldn't be on the victim for defending themselves, and it certainly should not be equalized with the blame of the instigator. Generally, people will feign ignorance in order to make themselves feel comfortable with a situation. We don't want to see the abuse of someone close to us because then that means we are obligated to do something about it. And oftentimes that means breaking the peace within a unit in order to defend the innocent. For some odd reason, people who refuse to go toe-to-toe with the instigators are somehow seen as the peacemakers, when in reality, they are oftentimes just tolerating or even facilitating the abuse. You've never thought of it that way, have you? But it's true. Choosing to ignore the abuse of the victim makes you a moral coward, and it also gives a nod to the abuser to continue. The responsibility then to keep the unit together falls on the victim with the duty to endure more abuse. So why can't you stay neutral? Other than the fact that it's absolute moral cowardice. If one party comes to you And side note, it's usually the instigator party that gets other people involved right away in order to push their narrative first and get the middle ground people on their side first. But if that person comes to you with a story, you owe it to the other side to get their story then too, in order to make a proper judgment call. Notice I said in order to make a proper judgment call, not in order to stay neutral. Information is power. It's power because you're supposed to use it. And you're supposed to use it wisely. Now, if both parties wish to keep you out of it completely, great, let them. But as soon as you have the bare minimum amount of information to make a moral judgment, you should. There's a big difference between staying neutral and not being involved. But of course, if one party is being abused, you should probably step back and notice. If there's a simple squabble between a couple people, they ought not involve a bunch of other people. And you're no worse off a person for not being involved in it. It's okay for there to be middle ground people who go on unaware of the squabble, and they aren't worse people for not knowing about it. The difference between neutrality and not being involved is the level of information you're given. If you aren't given any, huzzah, you're free, you're off the hook, carry on. Play peacemaker to your heart's content. But if you are given sufficient information to know what is going on, you have a moral duty to defend the abused. So how do you figure out which side is which? Easier said than done, huh? But I'll give you some hints. A lot of it has to do with each party's characters, past behaviors, and the kind of people who would vouch for them. I made another video about toxic behavior. Go give that a watch after this in order to get an exhaustive list about how toxic people behave. And toxic people are far more likely to be the instigators. I will say, though, that on that list, everybody's guilty of a few of them. The difference is that toxic people demonstrate those behaviors very often. You must also take time to consider each party's past behavior. If one party has been caught acting badly quite often, it's not that much of a leap to assume that their actions and behavior and motivation are suddenly not as pure as the driven snow. If one party has been known to do good often, especially not publicly, and they also have a history of being authentically bullied, they're more likely the doormats in the situation. Think also about the kind of people each party keeps company with. If one party is known for hanging out with known liars or people who have been abusive to others, that's a hint. If one of the parties is well liked by morally upstanding people who are willing to offer positive character testimonies, take that into account. And if one person trashes other people all the time, they're likely the instigators. It's just honestly not that difficult to figure out who the instigator is. And if you say it's too difficult, then you're living in denial. That usually means that you want to side with the instigator for whatever reason. Whether you've sided with them before, or you're afraid you'll look bad for you don't side with them, or whether or not you feel obligated because they're friends or family. Those who claim, I cannot figure out who is to blame for starting this, know exactly who's at fault. And they're feigning ignorance in order to look like the peacemakers sitting there crying, neutral, neutral, why can't we all just get along and sweep this under the rug? I just brought up how someone might side with the instigators because of loyalties. Now, loyalty is a virtue that I hold in high regard personally because it proves that someone isn't a coward. They're willing to stand up for something. They'll take a stand to defend either a conviction or a person whom they believe is morally convicted. People are oftentimes afraid to choose a side in a family or friend conflict because they're afraid of choosing wrong. Guess what? You might. Guess what else? That's okay. At least you've shown some kind of loyalty to something. If you find out later that you chose the abuser side, you can likely just come back to the abused wearing sackcloth and ashes and apologizing. And since the abused side tends to be a little bit more virtuous than the abuser side, it's likely they'll forgive you if you're genuine. I mean, at least at that point, you know they're more righteous than the people you sided with, right? Yes, realizing you chose wrong will not be the best feeling in the world. And yes, you will have to likely disown the guilty, but you should have done that in the first place if evildoers don't choose to stop their ways. You shouldn't even wait for someone who does evil things to harm someone whom you love. You should have corrected them before it got to that point. Something else you should probably hear is that people ought not to side with people, but rather moral convictions that would make the water far less murky. When you choose to follow goodness and veritas, it will be so much more clear to you who you ought to defend, even if it's not the person you wish you could back. It is cowardice to support someone whom you know has done wrong or abused others. We really ought to stand with moral convictions in order to create healthier expectations for humanity. Don't back the instigator. Back the truth. Be loyal to the truth. The other thing that most neutral parties don't realize is that the righteous party will likely disown you. Neutral people cry neutral because they don't want to lose out on the relationships with both sides. But if you side with the abuser, you're not going to continue having a good relationship with the abused. You push the innocent away as soon as you affirm their abuser by tolerating their behavior. If the innocent party doesn't physically cut out the abuser and the abuser's support system, they will at least create emotional and mental distance from you, starving you of the relationship you want with them anyway. Maybe you're the kind of person who's okay with that, though. Maybe you're the kind of person who has to have everybody show up for Christmas, and you're okay with forcing victims into rooms with their abusers because you don't care whether or not the victims like you anyway. Well, what you might not realize, even if you pull off stunts like that, is that the victims have created so much distance away from you that you don't even realize. And if your relationship with them isn't already dying, it's probably dead. So why be awful and try to force people together that way? The victims will likely see you as just as awful as their abusers for tolerating and facilitating their abuse. And the innocent party won't tolerate you forever. They'll fade away. Slowly but surely. And you'll ask yourself why these people don't want to talk to you or see you anymore. Has this happened to you? Have people in your life faded away? Could this be the answer as to why? The gist is, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you are aware of abuse happening in a unit and you don't address it, you will likely be standing alone with one party, and it's usually the party of the abusers. The righteous want nothing to do with evildoers or their cronies. I'm going to give you some examples now of things I've spoken about to hopefully help you understand. This first one is concerning how others might view people who try to stay neutral. Something that recently happened was in one group of friends, the group found out that one person was treating another person really terribly for months. All of this was in the shadows until it came to the light. When it did, and all of the information was seen, the majority of people in that friend group flocked to the innocent person to protect them and defend them. There was a person in this friend group who very openly and publicly wanted to stay neutral, which greatly disturbed the people who were defending the innocent party. Those people voiced their concern over this person's very public moral cowardice. And this person ended up losing friendships with people, very good, righteous people, because they refused to take a stand. People looked on in disgust as this person attempted to say that very clear abuse was unclear. That neutral party was only left with the abusers and the abusers' cronies, who obviously weren't the highest caliber of people. When they refused to pick a side, the righteous picked a side for them. When one of my children came to me and told me that another one of my children did something awful to them, do you suppose I said to them, "Well, did you deserve it? What led up to this?" No. I knew that a certain action was wrong and unacceptable, and it didn't matter the motivation for child B doing this, and that he ought to be in trouble for performing said action. I called them together and we worked it out. And as a parent, I didn't try to stay neutral because I love both of them and therefore didn't want to upset one of them. I corrected the wrongdoer and performed the moral duty as the middle person in their relationship. I made sure that amends were made and the harmed party was defended. This is not that hard. Let's say that same situation happened between your kid and someone else's kid. Well, it's got to be the other kid's fault, right? It is every time. That's the issue with siding with people rather than the truth. If little Timmy is hitting other kids on the playground and you stand up for him as a person rather than standing up for the truth and correcting him, he's going to get away with a lot of wrongdoing. Little Timmy's going to grow up to be an abusive instigator because his parents didn't correct him. So correct your children, even though, yes, they're your children, because your children aren't perfect, and they ought to be parented by someone who knows that. Lest we end up with even more abusive adults in the world. Support goodness and truth, even if it means not supporting the person you want to. Too many people cry that they want to stay neutral in small unit conflicts, in conflicts that really matter personally. And they've got no problem in the world posting all of their political and religious opinions, or really any opinions. They're not staying neutral there. There's nothing wrong for standing up for what you believe in. Whenever I see a small-time injustice, I'll still get involved. I don't walk away, even if I'll incur wrath for it, because I stand up for what's right. And I see far too many people who don't do this. And I believe in the motto, be for other people what you needed. Getting involved is good. Standing up for what's right is good. Don't try to convince yourself that you're somehow a better moral person for trying to act like a peacemaker just because you don't stand up for the abused. Good people defend the innocent. So let's wrap this up. Acknowledge that two sides do exist and that yes, one side is far more to blame than the other. Attempting to stay neutral when you have all the information you need to make a solid moral decision is moral cowardice. Not being involved is not the same thing as staying neutral, and the difference is the amount of information you have. Educate yourself to spot the instigating party. There's nothing wrong with loyalties, but you ought to be loyal to the truth rather than imperfect people. Don't let anyone tell you that by not getting involved, you're somehow a peacemaker. You're not. You are tolerating and facilitating abuse. If you try to stay neutral, you will end up with only one party. The innocent party will eventually disown you and create distance from you, whether physically, emotionally, or mentally. You won't be able to keep the unit together. You're just going to make it worse. And you're going to harm the innocent people in the end by not standing up for them. You condone evil when you do not confront it. Those who try to stay lukewarm will only be chewed up and spit out in the end.